By sunrise on July 7th, 1993, Seattle detectives already knew they were dealing with a homicide. A young woman had been found in the Central District. The violence was obvious. The questions were not, because within hours, investigators began assembling the pieces they did have: a body, a crime scene, witnesses, friends, a rough timeline, and eventually biological evidence connected to the person responsible. But knowing what happened and understanding what happened are two very different things, because the deeper investigators looked into Mia Zapata's final moments, the more the case seemed to fracture. Where had the attack actually occurred? How had she reached the location where she was found? Was the killer someone from Mia's world or someone completely outside it? Years would pass before investigators identified the man responsible, but on that first morning, they weren't trying to solve a decade-old mystery. They were trying to answer a much simpler question: what happened to Mia Zapata? Welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, the podcast where we dive deep into the mysteries that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John. And before we get started, you'll notice that Angela isn't joining me for this episode. Unfortunately, schedules didn't line up this week, and rather than delay the investigation, we decided to keep moving forward. One of the things that Angela brings to these conversations is the listener's perspective. She's often the person asking the questions many of you are probably asking at home, and she has a way of challenging assumptions that helps keep these discussions grounded. So you'll definitely feel her absence tonight, but rather than wait weeks for schedules to cooperate, we'd rather continue bringing you the story and keep the investigation moving. And Angela will be back soon. In our last episode, we focused on Mia Zapata herself, the artist, the musician, the friend, the voice that left such a lasting mark on Seattle's underground music scene. But by the morning of July 7, 1993, that story had become a homicide investigation. Detectives had a crime scene. They had witnesses. They had physical evidence. And they had a timeline that they immediately began trying to reconstruct. What they didn't have were answers, because the more investigators examined Mia's final moments, the more complicated the case became. Questions about where the attack occurred, how she arrived at the location where she was found, whether the person responsible came from inside Mia's world or from completely outside it. So tonight we'll examine what investigators knew, what they believed, and why some of the most important questions in this case proved so difficult to answer. So before the investigation began, we need to ask a simple question. Who was Mia Zapata on the day that she died? And what did her world look like before investigators ever became involved? And nothing about July 6th looked like the beginning of a homicide investigation. It looked like just an ordinary day in the life of a working Seattle musician. The Gits had just recently returned from a very successful West Coast tour, and Atlantic Records was actively pursuing the band. It said that they had a handshake agreement with Atlantic Records. Mia had recently met with the Atlantic A&R representative, Tim Summer, and Tim Summer was very interested in the Gits. So the band's future appeared very bright from the outside. Mia reportedly told Steve Moriarty that she had a really bad feeling about being back in Seattle. Their second album, Enter the Conquering Chicken, had been recorded, but like I said in episode 1, Mia wasn't happy with those recordings, and she intended to go back into the studio once they were back in Seattle and re-record the vocals for all tracks before release. So again, the version that was eventually released was not the version that she intended to release. And that success with Atlantic Records does not eliminate pressure, and artists, especially good artists like Mia was, are often their harshest critics. They're often the ones that when everybody else is listening to the track and saying, man, this is awesome, she's the one that's saying, it's just not right. It's just not right. I want it perfect. And that just is, I think, who Mia was. And that bad feeling comment really strikes a chord with me. She really had an uncomfortable feeling about being back in Seattle. And there's really no reason that she would have that feeling. So it just sits out there as a question mark. But Mia was standing at a major professional crossroads at this point, but she was still focused on the work ahead. So, as we discussed a little bit in episode 1, Mia was roughly 2 weeks sober at this point, and she was actively working to address her alcohol issues that had plagued her for a great portion of her life. They had, like I said, just came back from their West Coast tour, so they had tour fatigue. And Stephanie Sargent, the guitarist for 7 Year Bitch, had died about a year earlier to an overdose. And so Mia was still carrying the grief from that loss. And friends described her as being emotionally very raw during this period. And that in itself makes sobriety very difficult to maintain. Dealing with the loss of a close friend and the tragedy of a young woman dying from a drug overdose and the pressures of being on the road and everything kind of compounds to make it very difficult to maintain sobriety. But Mia was dealing with the same complicated mix of pressures that many people carry while still moving forward in their lives. And Mia was doing the same. She was moving forward in her own life, moving towards what looked like was going to be an amazing year for Mia Zapata and the Gits. Now, early that evening, Mia went to the Winston Apartments to rehearse with her side project that she was working on, a band called Hell Smells, which included her boyfriend. And it was just something else that she had going. We talked about this a lot in episode 1. All of the Gits were just saturated in music all the time. And they often had side projects going and different things that they were working on. And Hell Smells was that for Mia, at least during this period of time. And so she was at the Winston Apartments from approximately 6:30 to around 8:30 that night in rehearsals. And then she would move on to the Comet Tavern. The Winston Apartments was another area where friends and musicians were moving through there pretty regularly. And it was a very familiar environment to Mia. The Winston was part of Mia's normal routine. And, those trusted places often become the places that are very important when things go wrong. At 6:30 that night, the Winston Apartments really had no significance whatsoever. But as you'll see as we move through this episode, they're going to become very significant to the investigation. After leaving the Winston Apartments, Mia then went to the Comet Tavern. The Comet Tavern was located at 10th and Pike on Capitol Hill, and it was a regular gathering place for the Gits and for Mia and their whole social circle. It was walking distance from many venues and apartments and rehearsal spaces, and Mia was known as a regular. Her name is actually carved, or it was actually carved. It was still visible in 1998, carved into one of the back booths in the Comet. It was more of a social hub, really, than a performance venue for the Gits. And describing the Comet in 1993, it really is the quintessential dive bar. Probably the single most consistent first-person testimony about the old Comet in those years was the smell. The Stranger's farewell piece, published the week that the original Comet closed in 2014, describes it like this, quote, "It smells like peed out old beer that's been re-drinking and re-peed out onto the mushy linoleum duct tape Budweiser box bathroom floor." So that gives you a little bit of a sense of just what we're talking about here. Cigarette smoke was hanging in the air. Old beer soaked into the woods. Graffiti covered all of the booths. There was loud conversations. Musicians were drifting in and out between shows. It was a place where everybody seemed to know everybody. And there were Prohibition era tunnels running underneath it. Inside the Comet, there's a long wooden bar running down one side with a section at the end that regulars called the center of the universe. the prime real estate where the bartenders held court and the most established regulars would drink. And then along the opposite wall were carved up wooden booths, the surfaces of which had been progressively defaced by decades of patrons with knives and keys. And as I said, Mia's name was one of those, still visible when Alex Tizon visited in 1998 and wrote a piece for the Seattle Times. There were 2 pool tables in the Comet, including a lower one that the old-timers used for secret card games, and pinball machines along the walls. There was a back room that was used for drinking after the official 2 a.m. closing time, where regulars would hide and chain smoke past last call, and a loft upstairs that was used in later years for after-hours parties called Mama Camp that was hosted by the venue booker Mama Casserole or Michelle Smith. And then there were 4 creepy and infamous closets in the Comet, one containing machinery and the others said to be used regularly by the patrons for sexual encounters. Now, every music scene has a headquarters, and the Comet Tavern served that role for much of Seattle's underground scene. And it's why so many witnesses remembered seeing Mia Zapata there, while nothing about her presence really stood out. The Comet wasn't a destination for Mia. It was part of her everyday life. And by the time Mia walked into the Comet that evening, she was surrounded by familiar faces in a familiar place. Nothing about the day suggested that investigators would soon be trying to reconstruct it minute by minute. But as the evening continued, the details that had once seemed ordinary would become some of the most scrutinized moments in the entire case. And so that's where the timeline begins. Now, before investigators could determine who killed Mia Zapata, they first had to answer a more basic question. What exactly happened that night? Unlike many cases where the final hours are almost entirely unknown, detectives were actually able to reconstruct much of Mia's evening with surprising confidence. Friends remembered seeing her. Bartenders remembered serving her. People remembered conversations. They remembered where she went. The timeline wasn't perfect, but for most of the night, it was relatively clear. The uncertainty didn't begin immediately. It crept in slowly. And by the time investigators realized where certainty ended, Mia was already gone. So like I said, Mia left the Hell Smells rehearsal around 8:30, walks to the Comet, and begins settling into that familiar environment. She was surrounded by friends. It was just a regular night by all appearances. It was something that Mia did on such a regular basis that it's almost like walking to the kitchen or something like that. I think we all have those routines in our lives that it's just something we do so often we don't even think about it. That's also probably why nobody remembers anything unusual. It was just a normal evening. You can really just picture Mia, leaving the Winston Apartments, walking out into the streets of Seattle and streets that she knew so well, walking down to the Comet Tavern and opening the doors. And I think the first thing that would have hit her was the smell that was so talked about and almost iconic to the building. The combination of old pee and cigarette smoke, the graffiti covered booths all over the place, the noise, musicians in and out, maybe playing, the feeling that everybody knew everybody. This isn't a murder discussion. This is Mia's world. And nothing about Mia's arrival at the Comet suggested that investigators would later be trying to reconstruct every detail of that evening. Now, another thing was going on in Mia's life that night that I think that we need to talk about and try to understand. And that is her sobriety and her drinking that night. So as we know, Mia was approximately 2 weeks sober at this point. She was actively working on sobriety. It was something that she wanted. And there's a very real reason, or probably multiple very real reasons for that. But on June 27, 1992, the guitarist Stephanie Sargent from the band 7 Year Itch was found dead from a heroin overdose. And These were friends to Mia Zapata. They were friends to the Gits. And this death hit Mia very hard. I think that it caused her to kind of stop and maybe reevaluate her life. And it was one of the major decisions to try to work on her sobriety. And there's nothing new about this story that we're telling tonight when it comes to somebody that struggles with drug or alcohol abuse. Most times there is a cycle of sobriety and relapse until hopefully it finally sticks. And there's nothing unique about Mia as far as that goes. And on this night, she slips off the wagon. Now, there's no evidence that Mia was extremely intoxicated. Friends did not treat her as being impaired or incapable or somebody that needed protection because they were so drunk they didn't know what they were doing. She had had some drinks. We know that. We cannot say what her blood alcohol content is or anything like that, but we do know that she wasn't described as falling down drunk. And recovery is very rarely a straight line. Relapse is very common, and alcoholics often appear much less intoxicated than they actually are. They can function at a much higher level when they're intoxicated because it's a regular thing for them. But there is a difference between drinking and being totally incapacitated, and there's nothing to indicate that Mia was incapacitated. Understanding Mia's drinking does help us understand that night, but it does nothing to help explain what happened to her, and it certainly does not make her responsible for what would happen later that night. Mia's relapse is just part of the story of that evening, but it is not the story of her death. Now, we do know that Mia wanted to find Robert Jenkins, her former boyfriend. It was a significant emotional focus for that night. It was mentioned repeatedly. Around midnight, she leaves the Comet intending to go locate Robert. The search appears to have been unsuccessful. I want to be clear that Robert is not a suspect, and I don't think that Robert was a bad guy at all. He's described as being quite the opposite, actually. He was a really good guy. He was somebody that Mia clearly cared deeply for, and she wanted to go find him that night. And that happens a lot in relationships, especially when alcohol is involved. Alcohol raises those emotions, and when alcohol and emotions intersect, we all know how things change. It's not at all surprising that Mia had a few drinks and she decided that she wanted to go see Robert. We don't know what her intentions were, and it really doesn't matter. All that matters is that finding Robert that night was important to Mia, and that's not always the same thing as what's important to the investigation. And Robert's role in this case is not about his guilt. His role is just understanding Mia's decisions that night. And so she left the Comet shortly after midnight looking for Robert. And her moments after that point become a lot less certain. We don't really know what happened after she left the Comet until she finally makes her way back to the Winston Apartments. And when investigators go back and they try to reconstruct a timeline, oftentimes they'll know the destinations, but they don't know every step that's taken in between those destinations. They don't know where you stopped after you left point A, but before you got to point B. Some parts of this evening are able to be reconstructed. Some parts are documented. And then there's many parts that we just will never know. Even before Mia disappears from the timeline, there are portions of this evening that investigators can only partially reconstruct. But we do know that Mia arrives back at the Winston Apartments, eventually to the apartment of her friend, Tracy Victoria Kinley, who is known universally as TV. Kinley is 34 years old in July of 93, and she was the lead singer of Officer Down, which was a Seattle band that overlapped substantially with the Gits and Mia's social circle and musical orbit. She was also a vocalist in Hell Smells, which, if you'll remember, was the side project that Mia had been rehearsing with at the Winston earlier that evening from about 6:30 to 8:30, which means that Kinley was not just a peripheral friend, but a working musical collaborator who'd been in the same building with Mia now twice that same night. And Kinley lived in the Winston Apartments on the second floor. The building sits at Pike and 11th, and it has a central staircase that kind of winds its way down from the upper floors to the exit doors. Kinley was approximately 7 years older than Mia, and that age difference and the band overlap meant that she occupied kind of a particular role in Mia's social map. She was a peer musically, but slightly older in life experience, and she was someone whose apartment was known as a safe space within that whole ecosystem. Now, Mia did not go to the Winston with the intention of seeing TV Kinley. She went to the Winston actually to find her current boyfriend, who was a musician with Hell Smells, and his name has been kept out of the press at his request, and he was cleared early on in the investigation, so he had nothing to do with Mia's disappearance, and if he didn't want his name known, then that's fine. I am not going to try to figure it out because I respect his privacy, but it doesn't really factor in anyway because he was not there. And so instead of finding him and spending time with him, Mia decided to go up to the second floor to visit Kinley. So that visit to TV Kinley's apartment was a contingency. It was not the destination. If the current boyfriend had been at the Winston that night, then the entire scene would have unfolded differently, possibly producing the same outcome, but possibly not. And I say that in no way meaning that this is somehow her boyfriend's fault for not being there. Of course it wasn't. The sources seem to kind of disagree on Mia's demeanor when she got to TV's apartment. The Seattle Times would quote TV as saying that Mia was upset and distracted and mumbled a lot. I think we can say that Mia was upset, she was distracted, not drunk or incapacitated, and not raging. She was just upset. But another source describes Mia in much stronger terms, saying that she was very drunk and angry that she couldn't locate Jenkins and wanted to talk to him about their relationship. So there is a conflict in the accounts, but I really think the account that comes from TV Kinley's own statement is the one that we should rely upon, and it is not the one that describes Mia as being very drunk. Now, one thing that I did find in the Seattle Times article that I wasn't able to find anywhere else is this line right here when I say, quote, "At one point, Mia bolted from the apartment without saying anything, then returned minutes later and apologized." I don't know for sure what that's all about, but I think we could say that at some point during her time at Kinley's apartment, Mia left abruptly without any explanation, and then she came back within a few minutes and apologized for that. And it's a moment that almost nobody really talks about, but it tells us several things. First, it tells us that Mia was not asleep on the couch for the entire duration of her stay. She was awake enough, at least at one point, to leave the apartment and then return. And it tells us something in her emotional state was strong enough that it produced this sudden, unexplained exit and re-entry. And then third, this bolt out of the apartment happened before the 2 a.m. departure, which means that Mia's actual visit to Kinley's apartment had at least one prior moment of disruption. And I think that bolt is really the kind of detail that tells us that Mia was processing something very specific in that apartment, possibly about her ex-boyfriend, Robert Jenkins, possibly something about her current boyfriend, possibly something about the larger weight that she'd been carrying that night, potentially the record deal with the Gits, potentially slipping in her sobriety. We'll never know. Now, it is reported that Mia fell asleep on the couch in TV's apartment, and that's another fact that I wasn't really able to nail down as a fact. It's reported, but in that Seattle Times article, it is not clearly established that she fell asleep. It really doesn't matter. All that matters is we know that she left right around 2 a.m. because that's when Get Smart started on the Nickelodeon channel. Before we keep going, I want to take a quick second. If you've been listening to Dark Dialogue, you already know that this isn't just storytelling. Every episode is built around one goal: keeping the focus on the victim. and working towards the truth. So if that matters to you, make sure that you're following the show on whatever platform you're listening on. And if you haven't yet, take a second to leave a rating or a review. It makes a bigger difference than people realize. And it's what helps these cases reach people who otherwise wouldn't even hear them. All right, so let's get back to the story. TV urged Mia to sleep there that night, but Mia said that she would catch a cab home. And I think it's important to note that, a friend doesn't urge another friend to crash on their couch unless the friend recognizes that the other person is in some kind of state, emotionally or physically or both, that makes leaving somehow suboptimal. So Kinley's offer was not a polite courtesy. It was really a friend recognizing that another friend should maybe not be heading out into the night. But Mia declined, and that decision to leave was Mia's decision, and it was made over Kinley's objection. So this is not the picture of a friend that is pushing her out the door. It's a picture of a friend that is trying to keep her there, but Mia chooses to go for whatever reason. And Mia told Kinley that she would catch a cab home. And I think an interesting quote from that Seattle Times piece is, quote, Mia didn't have a driver's license and often took taxis, even though she told everyone she hated cabbies. So the plan, as Kinley stated it, was a cab. It was not to walk. Now, whether Mia actually attempted to find a cab after leaving the Winston is not documented. I couldn't find that anywhere. I don't think it's something that we know. We also don't know whether Mia walked down to a known cab stand, if she attempted to flag one down, if she gave up on the cab plan and started walking, or if she never attempted a cab at all. We just have no idea. But one thing that's really important in TV's account is that a rerun of Get Smart was just starting on the Nickelodeon channel, and that set a very clear timestamp at 2 a.m., July 7th, 1993. And then we enter this period with this time gap, which is reported alternately as 70 minutes and 80 minutes. Everything that I've researched, I've really come to believe that it is roughly 80 minutes in total. I think that we could say pretty safely that she left TV's apartment right around 2 a.m. because we have the Get Smart reference to go off of. And her body was discovered approximately 3:20 a.m., which is roughly 80 minutes in total. Now, 80 minutes does sound like a long time, but with everything that had to happen during that period of time, it becomes really tight. And how tight it becomes is really going to become an issue later on. But we can say that what had to have occurred was there had to be an encounter with the perpetrator and the abduction. And even in the most favorable scenario, getting a 5'8" woman into a vehicle against her will or by deception is not going to be instantaneous. So say maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And then you have to transport her to the assault location. Now, the prosecution will say that the assault happened in a house or a car, which is all over the map, but both imply movement from the encounter site to somewhere more private. Now, if the assault occurred in the vehicle itself, then that time could be nearly zero. But if it occurred in a residence, then you're looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 minutes, including parking and getting in the house and all that kind of stuff. And then you have the assault itself. And this is the most time-intensive piece of this 80-minute window. You have a sustained rape, a sustained beating severe enough to lacerate internal organs, a bite that broke the skin and would deposit saliva, which would be used later. So even if we compress this as much as we can, it is not a 5-minute sequence. Looking at comparable sexual homicides, the typical time period for the assault duration is somewhere in that 20 to 45 minute range. And so if we fall somewhere in a realistic middle, say 30 to 45 minutes. And then you have a transport to the dump site. Now, if the assault occurred somewhere very near the dump site, I'd say you're looking at maybe 5 to 10 minutes for that. And then we have this unusual body arrangement in a cross-legs pose which was described as deliberate. So it would have taken some time. Arms positioned perpendicular, ankles crossed, clothing pulled back. So this is not a body dump from a vehicle that's just dumped out and abandoned. It is a body that's laid out. So you're looking at a minimum of 3 to 5 minutes for that to occur. And then the killer has to leave that dead end before her discovery at 3:20, which say maybe 5 minutes for that. So if we look at the realistic minimum times for that, we have 3 minutes for the encounter and the abduction, 5 minutes for the transport, 30 minutes for the assault, 5 minutes to transport, 3 minutes to arrange the body, and 5 minutes to get the hell out of there. You're looking at 51 minutes. If they all hit the maximum time periods, it is the full 80 minutes. So the math does not create an impossible timeline, but it is absolutely pushing towards the outer edge of what 80 minutes can accommodate, with no margin for any kind of unexpected delay or traffic or any difficulty controlling Mia or pausing between the elements, or any time that's spent on activities that this reconstruction I just went through doesn't account for. And I think it's important to note that all of the stuff that I just went through, we know pretty much had to have happened. We don't know the exact order of how they happened. We don't know the exact timing. We don't know the exact location. The evidence tells us what happened, but it does not tell us precisely where or when it happened. The physical evidence answers some of the questions, but it also creates several others. Now, one of the earliest clues that the police received was a man had called and said that he'd heard a scream, and he described it as a terrifying scream that night. So terrifying that he was so distraught by what he heard that he got out of bed and rushed to see what was going on, but he saw nothing. He lived very close to the reservoir on 11th where Mia could have gone. Now, Volunteer Park in the Lincoln Reservoir corridor runs north of Pike at roughly 11th to 15th Avenue East. And that is the same axis as the Winston Apartments and the Comet Tavern. I think that it's at least very likely that the screams that this man heard were from Mia. Now, we don't actually know where the attack took place. Prosecutors use the phrase in a house or in a car. The assault location has never been identified, and there's no primary crime scene that's ever been located. And we know that the dump site is not necessarily the assault site, but based on this witness hearing these screams and looking at a map of the area, it's a logical leap, I think, to say that I believe Mia was abducted very near the Winston Apartments, maybe right in front of the Winston Apartments. She was driven to the Lincoln Reservoir area where she was assaulted and I think very likely murdered. And then she was driven south of that area where her body was eventually found. We just unfortunately don't know much of what happened in between that. What we do know is by the end of the summer of 1993, investigators knew that they were dealing with a brutal homicide. They had physical evidence. They had witness statements. They had theories, but what they didn't have was a name. And after years, that would remain the central problem. Because while the investigation had begun to answer questions about what happened to Mia Zapata, it was still no closer to answering the question that mattered the very most, and that is, who in the hell did this? Investigators had accumulated a substantial amount of information. You know, they knew who Mia was. They knew where she had spent most of her final evening. They had witness statements. They had some physical evidence. They had theories, but they didn't have a suspect. And as the weeks turned into months, the investigation found itself confronting a very difficult reality. The more people detectives eliminated, the fewer places there were left to look. So in the first 72 hours after Mia's body was discovered, the investigators came in, they secured the scene, they did a neighborhood canvass, they talked to anybody in the area, they identified this scream witness that we talked about, the autopsy was completed, the sexual assault was documented, and the bite mark on her breast was swabbed and preserved. And then obviously the family and the band and her friends were notified. Those first few days were extremely intense, and every homicide investigation starts with momentum and really a goal to solve it in the first 48 hours. Detectives are working long hours. The community is in absolute shock. The medical examiner preserved evidence that really had no obvious value in 1993, but it would become very critical years later. The investigation really started strong and it moved quickly. And one of the first people that investigators looked at was Mia's ex-boyfriend, Robert Jenkins. They also looked at her current boyfriend. They looked at TV Kinley. They looked at friends. They looked at the band members. They looked at other residents that lived in the Winston Apartments. They looked at the Comet Tavern regulars. This really was not tunnel vision. It was pretty standard homicide work. And the statistics with murder is, as we well know, most likely it is somebody that the victim knew. Ex-partners are always high on that list, and so they have to be examined. And that's really why detectives start with the relationships, because more times than not, people are killed by somebody that they knew and knew well. Now, today we know that they were working from a faulty framework, but that framework was very reasonable in 1993. Investigators really weren't making mistakes. They were just following the evidence that they had. As they worked through these lists, they started talking to these people. They began clearing people. They checked alibis, and the alibis held. The interviews held up. They conducted polygraphs, which produced nothing useful at all, and no suspects ever emerged. And so this is really where the frustration enters. Everybody involved in this case is very frustrated at this point. The investigators, the family, the band, the greater Seattle community. Every cleared person removes one possibility, but it doesn't create a new one. And investigations can become trapped this way, and it's really nobody's fault. Detectives were solving pieces of the puzzle, but without getting any closer to seeing what the picture was. The investigation was generating answers, but just not the answer. And this is when investigator Lee Herron was hired by the family and the band and brought in to look into this case. The community frustration was growing. The band held benefits with multiple big artists to raise enough money to hire this investigation, and Herron was hired roughly 5 weeks after the murder. Her investigation operated in parallel to the Seattle Police Department. And it wasn't an anti-police stance, and it's not that the Seattle Police Department wasn't working, but it was because the community wanted more resources focused on the case. Really, that's very unusual to bring a private investigator in, especially this early in a homicide investigation. But it really shows how the Seattle music community was mobilizing and how this case quickly became larger than just a normal homicide. So by the late summer of 93, Mia's case no longer belonged only to the investigators. It belonged to the community as well. And I really have to say that I think that the investigation's biggest problem at that point was they were working from the wrong framework, because both the Seattle Police Department and Herron focused heavily on people that Mia knew. And like I said just a minute ago, for very logical reasons. They conducted hundreds of interviews. They worked leads extensively, but no suspect ever emerged. And working from a wrong framework is not the same thing as conducting a bad investigation. They didn't really have any other place to start. And because of that, it's natural that even good investigators can still pursue the wrong path. The problem was not how much effort they were giving this case. The problem wasn't how committed they were to solving it. The problem was that the offender just wasn't where the investigators were looking. And honestly, stranger on stranger crimes are extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily difficult to solve. The investigation was not failing because people weren't working hard. It was failing because the underlying assumption was wrong. And that's not a critique. It's just a fact. But what happens when every lead runs out? The sad reality is that funding in a case like this eventually gets exhausted. The tip volumes slow down after a certain time. The investigation remains open, but no suspects identified. The physical evidence remains in storage, but there's really nowhere else to go. And this is extraordinarily frustrating for Mia's family, for any victim's family. It was frustrating for the band. It was frustrating for the community. It was frustrating for the investigators, all of them. And nobody quits, but nobody has an answer. And most importantly, by 1996, the case still wasn't solved. It wasn't even particularly close to being solved. 3 years of work had produced an enormous amount of information, and not a single person that investigators could confidently arrest or even look at as a viable suspect. So by the mid-1990s, Mia Zapata's case had become what every investigator fears. Not a mystery, a dead end. The evidence was still there. The witnesses were still there. The questions were still there. But the path forward had completely disappeared. And for years, that's where this case would remain, waiting for a breakthrough that nobody could yet see coming. Now, in our first episode, we remembered Mia Zapata, the musician, the artist, and the friend whose voice helped define an entire corner of Seattle's music scene. Tonight, we spent much of our time discussing timelines and witness statements and investigative theories and unanswered questions, and those things are all important. They help us to understand the case, but they can also make it easy to lose sight of the person at the center of it. Mia was more than an investigation. She was more than a crime scene, more than a cold case file. She was a daughter, a friend, a bandmate, a woman with plans that were still unfolding, a woman who still had songs left to write, a woman who still had places to go, and a woman whose future was stolen from her in the early morning hours of July 7th, 1993. This is Deliver Me from the J.J. Hawk Band, and this is Mia Zapata. There's a tendency in true crime to view a person's life through the lens of the crime that ended it, to work backward from the tragedy, to see the victim as they were found rather than as they lived. But Mia Zapata was never meant to be remembered as a homicide victim. She was meant to be remembered as a musician, as a friend, as a daughter, as a woman who poured every ounce of herself into the things that she loved. The people closest to Mia often describe her in ways that don't appear in police reports. They talk about her sense of humor, her loyalty, her stubbornness, her willingness to stand up for people who needed someone in their corner. They talk about late nights, long conversations, road trips, rehearsals, and the small moments that become memories before anyone realizes they're making them. Those are the things that build a life. Those are the things that matter. When we look back at July of 1993, it is easy to focus on what was lost. The music that was never recorded, the opportunities that never arrived, the years she never had the chance to live. And those losses are real, but they are only a tiny part of Mia's story, because what remains is just as important. The impact that she had on the people around her, the friendships that she built, the art she created, the courage that she inspired in others, and the community that refused to allow her memory to disappear. More than 3 decades have passed since Mia's death, yet people still listen to her music. still tell stories about her, still speak her name, not because of the way she died, but because of the way she lived. Because long after the headlines faded and the investigation stalled, the people who loved her continued carrying a piece of her with them. And in many ways, they still do. So tonight, we remember Mia Zapata, a musician, a friend, a daughter, an incredible voice that left an unmistakable mark on the people fortunate enough to hear it. Mia was 27 years old. She was loved, she is remembered, and she will not be forgotten.
For me.